April the 17th, 1938, 06:30 hours. Somewhere near Castle Bromwich, Birmingham, Arthur Hendricks clocked in at what the sign outside called Midlands Agricultural Supply Company, a sprawling warehouse complex that had appeared seemingly overnight on former farmland 18 months earlier. The local paper had run a brief story about the construction, something about modern storage facilities for grain and farming equipment, distribution hub for the Midlands. Nobody had paid much attention. Warehouses were boring. Arthur walked past the office section where filing cabinets visible through windows contained paperwork for agricultural transactions that would never be audited too closely, past the loading dock where lorries arrived and departed with regularity that suggested legitimate commerce. Then he descended a staircase that didn't appear on any public blueprint, passed through a security checkpoint where two men in civilian clothes checked his identification with thoroughness that no agricultural warehouse would ever require, and entered a factory floor that stretched nearly a quarter-mile beneath the innocent structure above. The noise hit him first, as it did every morning. The scream of metal lathes, the pneumatic punch of riveting guns, the clatter of assembly lines, the shouts of foremen over the din. Hundreds of workers, many of them women, stood at stations producing components that fit together in ways that had nothing to do with agriculture. Arthur made his way to his section, where he supervised the production of wing spars for Supermarine Spitfire fighters. The warehouse above them stored grain and fertilizer. The factory below them was arming Britain for a war that hadn't started yet, that the government publicly insisted wouldn't happen, that Germany supposedly didn't know Britain was preparing for. Arthur pulled on his work gloves and began his shift, one small part of the largest coordinated deception in British industrial history. The arithmetic of vulnerability. Britain in the mid-1930s faced a problem that could be expressed in simple numbers, but had no simple solution. The Treaty of Versailles had limited German rearmament after World War I, but by 1935, Adolf Hitler had publicly repudiated those restrictions and begun rebuilding German military capacity with alarming speed. Intelligence reports reaching London suggested Germany was producing military aircraft at rates that dwarfed Britain's modest peacetime manufacturing capacity. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. Britain's established aircraft manufacturers, firms like Supermarine, Hawker, Bristol and Vickers, operated factories whose locations were well known, whose production capacity could be estimated from factory size and workforce, whose output could be monitored by anyone with patience and binoculars. In 1935, these factories together could produce perhaps 2,000 military aircraft per year if operating at maximum capacity. Germany, intelligence suggested, would soon be producing 3 times that number. A conventional response would have been to expand existing factories, build new ones under the manufacturers' names, increase capacity visibly and openly. But such expansion would be immediately obvious to German intelligence, which maintained networks in Britain just as Britain maintained networks in Germany. Every new factory built, every expansion announced, every worker hired would signal to Berlin exactly how seriously Britain was taking the German threat and exactly how quickly British rearmament was proceeding. More critically, visible concentration of aircraft production in known locations created vulnerability that modern warfare had made catastrophic. The Great War had demonstrated that industrial capacity determined military capability. The Spanish Civil War, ongoing since 1936, was demonstrating that aircraft could strike deep into enemy territory, destroying factories and infrastructure far from any front line. If war came, Germany would know exactly where to bomb to cripple British aircraft production because Britain's aircraft factories were marked on maps, listed in directories, visible from the air. The problem demanded a solution that was counterintuitive. Britain needed to expand military production massively while simultaneously hiding that expansion from German observation. The nation needed to build factories that didn't look like factories, that didn't appear in industrial surveys, that employed thousands of workers without creating obvious concentrations of labor, that produced military equipment in volumes that would shock Germany when revealed, but remained invisible until that revelation became strategically useful. The solution that emerged from Whitehall corridors and Air Ministry planning sessions had a name that captured its essence perfectly: the Shadow Factory Scheme. The architect's careful plan, Sir Kingsley Wood, appointed Secretary of State for Air in 1938, inherited a programme that had begun 3 years earlier under his predecessor but needed dramatic expansion. The concept was elegant in its deviousness. The British government would build new factories specifically for military production, but would disguise their purpose, ownership, and output through layers of misdirection. The scheme operated on several interconnected principles. First, factories would be built not by aircraft manufacturers, but by automotive and engineering firms whose civilian production provided cover. Companies like Austin, Rootes, Standard Motor Company, and Rover would construct facilities ostensibly for automobile production or general engineering, but designed from the beginning for aircraft manufacture. This provided plausible explanation for new factory construction. Britain's automotive industry was growing. New factories made sense without requiring military justification. Second, factories would be geographically dispersed rather than concentrated near existing aircraft. Production. While Supermarine built Spitfires in Southampton, shadow factories would produce Spitfire components in Birmingham, Coventry, Manchester, and other locations scattered across Britain. If Germany bombed Southampton, Spitfire production would continue. If they bombed Birmingham, Southampton would carry on. Only by destroying dozens of facilities simultaneously could Germany cripple British aircraft production, and they couldn't destroy facilities they didn't know existed. Third, the factory's military purpose would be concealed through careful management of what was visible. Buildings would be designed to look like civilian structures, warehouses or light engineering facilities, rather than military production plants. The most sensitive manufacturing would occur in underground sections or interior spaces, not visible from roads or air. Workers would be instructed to maintain secrecy about their actual work. Official records would show civilian production, even as military components rolled off assembly lines. Fourth, the program would be financed through government funds, but administered through private companies, creating ownership structures that obscured direct government control. A shadow factory might be owned on paper by an automotive company, financed by government loans that didn't appear in military budgets, managed by civilian directors who reported through channels that didn't lead, obviously, to the Air Ministry. The planning was meticulous. Air Ministry officials worked with architects and engineers to design factories that maximized production efficiency while minimizing visible military character. They identified sites near transportation networks, but away from obvious strategic targets. They coordinated with local authorities who were told enough to facilitate construction, but not enough to compromise secrecy. They established supply chains that could deliver raw materials without creating obvious patterns that would signal military production. By 1936, construction had begun on dozens of sites. By 1938, that number had expanded to hundreds, and through it all, British newspapers reported occasional stories about new warehouses, new automotive facilities, new light engineering plants, nothing that would concern anyone, just Britain's economy modernizing, nothing to do with war that everyone hoped wouldn't come. From fields to factories, the transformation of rural farmland into industrial production centres happened with speed that would have been remarkable even without the secrecy requirements. The Castle Bromwich site where Arthur Hendricks worked had been wheat fields in early 1937. By summer 1938, it housed one of the largest aircraft production facilities in Britain, capable of eventually producing 320 Spitfires per month, a rate that would have seemed impossible to pre-war observers. Construction followed patterns designed to minimize attention. Initial work appeared to be preparing ground for agricultural warehousing, precisely what permissions indicated. Foundations went deep, but foundations for large warehouses needed depth. Steel framework went up quickly, but modern construction techniques made rapid building unremarkable. The structure was vast, but agricultural distribution centers required space. Then, after the visible shell was substantially complete, different work began. Interior construction that created factory floors invisible from outside. Installation of machinery that arrived in unmarked crates during night shifts. Connection to power supplies that fed underground cables rather than obvious overhead lines. Ventilation systems that expelled air through dispersed outlets rather than concentrated stacks that would signal intense industrial activity. Recruitment proceeded carefully. Workers were hired through civilian companies for civilian work, told they'd be producing automotive components or agricultural equipment. Only after employment, after security checks that workers didn't realize were more thorough than normal jobs required, were they gradually introduced to actual production. A worker might spend weeks making metal components before realizing those components were wing parts for fighter aircraft. By then, they'd signed Official Secrets Act paperwork and understood that discussing their work was prohibited. The workforce included surprising diversity. Men formed majority, but women were recruited extensively, particularly for assembly work that required dexterity more than strength. This was pragmatic rather than progressive. War was coming, men would be conscripted, and Britain needed workers who could sustain production during conflict. Women proved capable of precision work that factory managers initially doubted they could perform. Training occurred on site using experienced workers transferred from established aircraft manufacturers. These veterans brought expertise in aircraft production techniques while maintaining cover of working for automotive companies. A skilled riveter from Supermarine might officially be employed by Roots Motors, but spend his days teaching new workers how to rivet Spitfire fuselages. The fiction was maintained in paperwork even as reality diverged completely. Quality control presented unique challenges. Military aircraft required precision that civilian products didn't demand. A defective automobile part might cause inconvenience. A defective aircraft component could kill pilots. Shadow factories needed to achieve military manufacturing standards while officially producing civilian goods. This required inspectors who moved between facilities, checking quality without creating paper trails that connected shadow factories to military production. The Air Ministry established inspection networks that operated through front companies, civilian firms that existed primarily to provide bureaucratic cover for military quality assurance. The hidden scale by September 1939, when Germany invaded, Poland and Britain declared war. The shadow factory scheme had created production capacity that shocked even British officials who'd authorized its construction. Conservative estimates suggested shadow factories could produce 1,500 aircraft per month once fully operational, triple Britain's visible capacity. Some facilities hadn't reached full production. Ramping up complex manufacturing takes time, but the infrastructure existed, the workers were trained, the supply chains were established. Germany's intelligence services had failed comprehensively to identify the scheme's scale. They knew Britain was rearming. That was unavoidable. They'd identified expansion at known aircraft factories, but they'd missed the shadow facilities entirely or dismissed them as civilian construction. German assessments of British aircraft production capacity in early 1939 underestimated actual capacity by more than half. This wasn't German incompetence, but rather testament to how effectively Britain had concealed industrial expansion through misdirection and administrative complexity. The deception extended to specific aircraft types. Germany knew Britain was producing Spitfires and Hurricanes. Intelligence had identified the primary factories. What they didn't know was that by 1939, Spitfire production was distributed across 9 major facilities and dozens of smaller component manufacturers. Destroying Supermarine's Southampton works would have inconvenienced but not stopped Spitfire production. Castle Bromwich alone, once fully operational in 1940, would produce more Spitfires monthly than Germany believed Britain's total production capacity could achieve. Similar patterns existed for other aircraft types. Hurricane production had been shadowed to Gloucester Aircraft and Austin Motors facilities that Germany hadn't connected to military manufacturing. Wellington bomber production involved Roots Securities and Chester facilities operating under civilian cover. Even engine production, arguably more difficult to conceal than airframe construction, had been successfully dispersed through shadow facilities producing Bristol, Rolls-Royce and other engine types in locations Germany hadn't identified. The scheme extended beyond aircraft to munitions, vehicles and equipment. Shadow factories produced artillery shells in facilities officially manufacturing agricultural equipment. They produced tank components in plants supposedly dedicated to automotive manufacturing. They produced radar equipment in electronics facilities Germany believed were producing civilian radios. The scope was comprehensive, touching virtually every category of military production Britain required. Coordination of this dispersed production required administrative systems as innovative as the factories themselves. The Air Ministry established production networks that tracked components from dozens of suppliers, coordinated delivery to assembly facilities, monitored quality across distributed manufacturing, all while maintaining civilian paperwork that disguised military purpose. It was logistics nightmare made functional through careful planning and dedicated civil servants who understood that administrative excellence was as crucial to national defence as factory production. The workers' daily deception, life inside shadow factories, required constant awareness of dual identity. Workers clocked in at civilian companies carried identification for firms that didn't primarily manufacture what workers actually made, received pay packets from organisations whose official business bore no relation to their daily labour. This wasn't merely administrative quirk, but essential security practice that required everyone's cooperation. Mary Blackwell worked at what her ration book listed as Standard Motor Company, Coventry facility. Her identification badge said the same. Her national insurance contributions were recorded as automotive industry employment. In reality, she spent 8 hours daily installing hydraulic systems in Bristol Beaufighter fuselages. The cognitive dissonance was constant, but became routine through repetition. Workers were instructed explicitly not to discuss their work outside factory walls. Official Secrets Act signings weren't ceremonial, but carried legal weight that was emphasized repeatedly. Posters throughout facilities reminded workers that careless talk cost lives, that enemy agents listened, that secrecy was patriotic duty. Most workers complied not just from legal concern, but from genuine understanding that their silence protected Britain. This created social complications. Workers couldn't tell families what they actually did, couldn't explain why their supposedly automotive work sometimes meant coming home smelling of aircraft dope or explaining metal slivers from aluminum aircraft components when they officially worked with automotive steel. Families learned not to ask too many questions, accepting vague explanations about war work that couldn't be discussed. The secrecy extended to workers' daily movements. Shadow factories often operated multiple shifts to maximize production, with workers arriving and departing at staggered times to avoid creating obvious patterns. Large numbers of workers entering and leaving simultaneously would signal significant industrial activity. Dispersed shift changes looked more like normal factory operations. Workers might arrive in darkness and leave in darkness, never seeing their workplace in daylight. further disconnecting visible activity from actual production levels. Social life within factories developed around shared secret. Workers knew they were collectively maintaining deception, that everyone understood the difference between official fiction and actual reality. This created camaraderie born from conspiracy. Workers bonded by shared knowledge they couldn't discuss with anyone outside their facility. They developed informal codes for discussing their work, referring to aircraft by nicknames, using euphemisms for military components, finding ways to talk about their daily experience without technically violating security requirements. Management of this workforce required unusual skills. Foremen needed technical expertise to oversee complex manufacturing, but also needed to maintain security culture, to notice if workers seemed indiscreet, to balance production pressure with secrecy requirements. The best managers understood that workers weren't just making aircraft components, but maintaining national deception, and that both tasks were essential. When war came, September 3rd, 1939, brought relief mixed with dread to shadow factory workers. Britain was at war, officially and openly. The pretense that they were making civilian goods became unnecessary. Factories could acknowledge their military production without compromising security, because Germany now knew Britain had been arming, even if German intelligence still didn't understand the full scope. Production intensified immediately. Factories that had been ramping up gradually shifted to maximum output. Workers who'd been hired in anticipation of war suddenly found themselves working extended hours, 6-day weeks, producing aircraft and equipment for military that urgently needed every unit they could manufacture. The shadow factories that had been building capacity secretly for 4 years now unleashed that capacity in volumes that exceeded even optimistic planning estimates. The Battle of Britain in summer 1940 provided dramatic vindication of the shadow factory scheme's value. Germany's Luftwaffe attacked Britain expecting to achieve air superiority through destroying RAF aircraft on the ground and overwhelming British production capacity. They bombed known aircraft factories, hitting Supermarine Southampton Works, damaging Hawker facilities, attacking obvious military production sites. But Spitfire production continued from Castle Bromwich, from dispersed component manufacturers across Birmingham and the Midlands. Hurricane production continued from shadowed facilities that Germany hadn't identified. Britain's aircraft production actually increased during the Battle of Britain, replacement aircraft arriving faster than RAF losses, a situation Germany hadn't predicted and couldn't counter through bombing because they didn't know where to bomb. German intelligence eventually identified some shadow facilities through observation of increased activity, through interrogation of captured RAF pilots who mentioned aircraft production that didn't match German estimates, through simply noting that British aircraft numbers didn't decline as expected despite successful bombing raids. But by then, the strategic advantage had been secured. Britain had entered the war with production capacity Germany had underestimated, had sustained that production through early bombing, had used the time purchased by superior numbers to further expand capacity and develop improved aircraft types. The scheme's success wasn't just about numbers, though numbers were impressive. Britain produced approximately 15,000 aircraft in 1940, far more than Germany believed possible. More importantly, the dispersed production meant no single bombing raid could cripple British capacity. Germany would have needed to simultaneously destroy dozens of facilities, many of which they still hadn't identified. The redundancy and dispersion that seemed inefficient from pure production standpoint proved strategically invaluable when bombing began. The transformation revealed, as the war progressed and security concerns shifted from concealing capacity to protecting specific production, shadow factories' military character became increasingly obvious. Buildings that had looked like warehouses sprouted anti-aircraft batteries. Facilities that had operated under civilian names began displaying Air Ministry signage. Workers who'd been told to be discreet about their employment now found their work referenced in newspapers as propaganda showcasing British war production. The civilian companies that had provided cover mostly transitioned to acknowledged military production. There was no longer benefit to maintaining fiction that Standard Motor Company was producing automobiles when obviously they were making aircraft fuselages. The automotive firms had genuinely been producing some civilian vehicles alongside military work, maintaining the cover, but by 1940, virtually all production had converted to military equipment. Some shadow factories expanded dramatically beyond original designs. Castle Bromwich eventually became Britain's single largest aircraft production facility, employing over 12,000 workers and producing more than 12,000 Spitfires during the war. What had begun as modest deception, a shadow facility concealing military purpose, became acknowledged industrial powerhouse whose production numbers were publicized to boost morale. Other facilities remained relatively obscure throughout the war, not because of continued deception, but simply because they weren't particularly newsworthy. A factory producing wing components for Wellingtons was doing essential work but wasn't creating complete aircraft, wasn't associated with famous designs, didn't make compelling propaganda. Workers in these facilities continued their labor with minimal public recognition, knowing their components were crucial but wouldn't be celebrated individually. The workforce evolved as war demands changed. Initial workers from 1937-1938 became skilled veterans training new employees as factories expanded. Women's percentage of workforce increased dramatically as conscription removed men to military service. By 1942, women constituted majority of workers in many shadow factories, performing work that pre-war assumptions had insisted required men. The war was destroying those assumptions comprehensively, demonstrating that industrial capacity depended more on training and determination than gender. Quality concerns that had seemed paramount in peacetime acquired different character during war. Aircraft still needed to be reliable. Crashed aircraft killed pilots, regardless of whether crashes resulted from combat or mechanical failure. But perfect became enemy of good enough. Factories learned to balance quality with production speed, to identify which tolerances were genuinely critical and which could be relaxed slightly to increase output. This wasn't carelessness, but maturation of understanding about practical engineering under combat conditions. The reckoning of innovation, Britain's shadow factory scheme, ultimately produced more than 100,000 aircraft during World War II, representing roughly half of Britain's total wartime aircraft production. The facilities that had been conceived as temporary deception to hide rearmament became permanent industrial infrastructure that sustained British fighting capability throughout 6 years of conflict. The strategic advantage gained by concealing production capacity's scale is difficult to quantify precisely, but was undeniably significant. Germany's underestimation of British production informed Luftwaffe planning for Battle of Britain, leading to assumptions about attrition rates and replacement capacity that proved catastrophically wrong. Germany believed destroying several hundred RAF aircraft would cripple British air defence because British production couldn't replace losses quickly. Shadow factories proved that assumption false, producing replacement aircraft in volumes that allowed RAF to absorb losses and continue fighting. The scheme also demonstrated industrial planning approaches that influenced post-war practice, dispersed production reducing vulnerability to bombing, diversified supply chains preventing single-point failures, coordination of component manufacture from multiple suppliers. These concepts became standard in Cold War military industrial planning. NATO's approach to industrial mobilization drew directly from British wartime experience with shadow factories. For workers who'd spent years maintaining deception, the war's end brought mixed feelings. Pride in their contribution was obvious. They'd helped build aircraft that won Battle of Britain, that protected convoys in Atlantic, that bombed Germany into submission, but the secrecy they'd maintained meant their specific contributions weren't publicly recognised. Post-war accounts of British aircraft production focused on famous manufacturers and famous aircraft, mentioning shadow factories as footnote rather than central element. Workers who'd spent years at Standard Motor Company making Bow fighters found their contributions summarised as wartime conversion of automotive production rather than recognised as purpose-built deception that had fooled German intelligence. Some shadow factories converted to civilian production after war, returning to automotive manufacturing or other peacetime uses. Others were sold to companies needing industrial space, becoming factories for different products. A few were demolished, their temporary buildings not worth maintaining once military production ended. Castle Bromwich continued aircraft production into the jet age, building Spitfire's successors before eventually converting to automotive production in the 1970s. The unglamorous genius the Shadow Factory scheme wasn't celebrated because deception rarely is, even successful deception that serves national interest. Britain preferred narratives of brave pilots in Spitfires to stories of administrative planning and industrial misdirection. Few home-front experiences captured public imagination like Blitz survival. Even fewer captured attention like bureaucrats carefully arranging factory financing to disguise military purpose. But the scheme represented triumph of careful planning and coordinated execution on scale that matched any military campaign. Hundreds of facilities built, tens of thousands of workers recruited and trained, security maintained across years despite thousands of people knowing fragments of larger secret production capacity hidden until strategically revealed, all executed while Germany actively tried to assess British military capabilities. The workers who made it function did so without recognition they deserved. Arthur Hendricks worked at Castle Bromwich through 1943 before being conscripted, spending war's final years in Royal Engineers. His contribution to war effort arguably had been greater during those years making Spitfires, producing weapons others used to fight, but military service earned recognition that factory work didn't. Mary Blackwell worked at Standard through 1945. Installing hydraulic systems in aircraft after aircraft, developing expertise that served no peacetime purpose and wasn't honoured in post-war years when society expected women to return to domestic roles. What remained after war was memory among those who participated, understanding that they'd been part of something larger than their individual labour. Workers knew factories they'd worked in hadn't existed on German intelligence maps. New aircraft they'd built had surprised enemy with their numbers, knew their secrecy had protected Britain during vulnerable years of rearmament. That knowledge had to suffice because public recognition wasn't forthcoming. The shadow factories themselves, those that survived past war's end, stood as monuments to pragmatic genius that had armed Britain while Germany remained oblivious. Ugly buildings, most of them, functional structures designed for production rather than aesthetics. But within those walls, workers had built aircraft that saved Britain, had maintained secrets that deceived Germany, had demonstrated that industrial capacity carefully planned and cleverly concealed could be as decisive as military courage. Britain entered World War II with aircraft production capacity that Germany had catastrophically underestimated, capacity built in shadows, maintained through deception, revealed when strategic situation made revelation advantageous. That capacity proved decisive in Battle of Britain and remained crucial throughout war, producing aircraft that sustained British fighting capability through years when defeat seemed possible. The Shadow Factory scheme wasn't triumph of British character or testament to indomitable spirit, though both were evident. It was careful planning executed competently, deception maintained successfully, industrial capacity built intelligently. Not glamorous, not dramatic, just effective. The factories built in shadows came into light when needed most, and that transformation from secret to acknowledged, from shadowed to revealed, demonstrated that sometimes victory depends not on fighting, but on preparing to fight in ways enemy doesn't notice, until preparation becomes action and surprise becomes advantage. Britain's ghost factories weren't ghosts at all, but solid structures full of workers making real weapons. They were ghosts only to German intelligence, invisible until too late, hidden until revealing them served purpose. And in that carefully maintained invisibility lay their genius and their contribution to survival of nation that couldn't afford to lose war it had tried desperately to avoid, but ultimately had no choice but to fight.